Why is Britain in such a mess? And what can be done about it? A brief trip back to my native Britain the other week was a deeply depressing experience. There had been widespread rioting in cities across England following the murder of 3 young girls in Southport at a Taylor Swift dance class. A large number of Brits, I think it's fair to say, are extremely agitated about uncontrolled, often illegal, immigration. Tens of thousands of migrants have been allowed to flood into the country on small dinghies from France. 1 in 27 people now living in Britain have arrived in the past 2 years. 4 in 10 of the foreign-born population in Britain have arrived in the country within the past decade. There's a palpable sense that nothing in Britain runs the way that it should, least of all the criminal justice system. The number of recorded rapes in England and Wales in 2023-2024 was 3 times higher than a decade before. A recent investigation discovered that across much of the country, the police hadn't identified a single suspect for neighbourhood crimes over the past 3 years. Not a single one. Only a few weeks before the unrest erupted, the authorities announced that even violent offenders would be released from prison after serving a mere 40% of their sentences. Then came the riots, and the authorities suddenly discovered that it is possible to arrest and prosecute wrongdoers after all. Prosecutions that would normally take months to come to court were being dealt with in a matter of days. That, plus the return of British rain, seems to have dampened the spirits of the troublemakers, thankfully. Instead of clamping down on immigration or addressing some of the underlying concerns about Muslim integration or lack thereof, the British authorities seem to find it easier to clamp down on free speech, prosecuting people for obnoxious opinions about either immigrants or Muslims expressed online. The most senior official in charge of public prosecutions in Britain has declared that he has a team of dedicated police officers scouring social media posts to arrest people for posting things that are insulting or abusive. He even threatened to extradite people to the UK for sharing material online. All of this has helped contribute to the widely held idea that Britain now has a 2-tier criminal justice system. Having cheerfully announced they would be letting violent criminals out of prison early, the authorities now threaten people with jail time for expressing idiotic views on social media. In Cheshire, the police boasted of arresting a woman for what they called an inaccurate social media post. In order to fully understand why Britain is in such a sorry state, it's essential to appreciate what's gone wrong with the country's judiciary. Mass immigration has become an explosive issue in Britain because judges have routinely thwarted attempts by successive governments to control it. In 2010, 2015, 2017 and 2019, British voters voted repeatedly to end mass immigration. It's not happened because judges have systematically prevented elected governments from controlling the country's borders. British judges only ever seem to rule in favour of illegal migrants remaining in the country. They do so on the basis of what they think the law ought to be, not the laws that Parliament has actually passed. Britain, a once orderly high-trust society, has become increasingly lawless because judges have routinely failed to apply sentences that ordinary Britons would regard as just. So it's commonplace for violent robbers and rapists to be given community sentences rather than go to prison. So common it's seldom reported anymore. So why are British judges so awful? Because they're unaccountable to the British public. In Britain, judges are appointed. They're not elected like in America. Until 2006, at least the appointments were made by an elected minister, meaning there was some degree of democratic oversight. Since 2006, Britain's judges have been appointed by something called the Judicial Appointments Commission, a body obsessed with diversity, equity and inclusion rather than justice. Thanks to human rights laws, British judges are not merely unaccountable. They regard judicial activism as part and parcel of their job. Liberty and order in Britain are collapsing as a consequence. At some point, we have to hope that a new Margaret Thatcher emerges in Britain, someone with the vision and the principle to save the country from decline. On its current trajectory, Britain is drifting towards the abyss of a sectarian society. In 2001, there were 1.5 million Muslims in Britain. Today, 4 million. If even a small percentage of British Muslims adhere to the Islamist teachings of Sayyid Qutb, the man who helped create contemporary political Islamism, the country has a massive problem. Far from addressing the problem, right now Britain is a country that cannot even bring itself to acknowledge that it has a problem. Any new Thatcher figure will need, of course, to address Britain's underlying economic problems the way she did. Thanks to net zero energy policies, extraordinary restrictive regulations, high taxes and excessive public spending, the UK has had remarkably little per capita growth over the past decade. But far more important than fixing the economy, Britain needs a state machinery capable of addressing issues of culture and cohesion. Old assumptions and long-established precedents governing citizenship in Britain are going to have to change. For that to happen, the next Thatcher needs to recognise that much of the machinery of the British state, as it stands, is dysfunctional. Reform is long overdue. We need judges who come under some sort of democratic oversight. Senior civil servants must no longer be given the luxury of deciding whether or not to implement policies that happen to clash with their own preferences. Those elected to Parliament, not unelected officials, need to be able to decide if the country can afford taxes or if it can afford not to cut taxes. Britain can only be pulled back from the brink by a leader that recognises it's time to treat the judiciary and the administrative state the way Margaret Thatcher treated the trade unions and the National Union of Miners.